What happens when a millionaire marries an ugly black beggar for a bet? But the wedding night reveals a shocking secret. It all started on a cold, rainy evening in the heart of New York City, where the glittering skyline hid the shadows of secrets and the whispers of desperation. In a luxurious penthouse overlooking Central Park, a group of wealthy socialites gathered for one of their infamous parties. Champagne flowed, laughter echoed, and bets were made, some harmless, others life-altering. Among them was Ethan Blackwood, a self-made millionaire known for his arrogance and love for high-stakes games. But tonight, the stakes were higher than ever. Ethan, with his perfectly tailored suit and a smirk that could charm or cut, leaned back in his leather chair, swirling a glass of expensive scotch. "I'll do it," he declared, his voice dripping with confidence. "I'll marry the first person who walks through that door, no matter who they are." The room erupted in laughter and disbelief. "You're bluffing, Ethan," someone shouted. But Ethan wasn't bluffing. He never did. His pride was on the line, and he was determined to prove he could handle anything, even a marriage to a stranger. The door creaked open, and in walked a figure that silenced the room. She was a beggar, her clothes tattered, her face smudged with dirt, and her hair a tangled mess. Her name was Clara, though no one bothered to ask. The room burst into laughter again, but Ethan's eyes narrowed. He saw something in her, something beyond the dirt and rags. Maybe it was the fire in her eyes, or the way she carried herself with a quiet dignity. "Well," Ethan said, standing up, "a bet's a bet." The room gasped as he extended his hand to Clara. "Will you marry me?" Clara hesitated, her eyes scanning the room filled with mocking faces. She had nothing to lose and everything to gain. "Yes," she said softly, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. The room erupted into cheers and jeers, but Ethan and Clara were already lost in their own world. The wedding was arranged within days, a lavish affair that made headlines. The world watched in disbelief as the millionaire married the beggar. But no one could have predicted what would happen on their wedding night. The night began like any other wedding night, champagne, laughter, and awkward small talk. But as the hours passed, Ethan noticed something strange about Clara. She wasn't what she seemed. Her hands, though rough, moved with a grace that betrayed her beggar's disguise. Her words, though simple, carried a wisdom that didn't match her supposed station. And then, as the clock struck midnight, Clara revealed her secret. "I'm not who you think I am," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Ethan froze, his glass halfway to his lips. "What do you mean?" he asked, his heart pounding. Clara took a deep breath and began to unravel the truth. She wasn't a beggar. She was a journalist, working undercover to expose the corruption and cruelty of the city's elite. Her assignment? To infiltrate Ethan's world and reveal the dark secrets he and his friends had been hiding. Ethan's world shattered. The woman he had married, the woman he had begun to feel something for, was a lie. But as Clara spoke, he realized something else. She wasn't just a journalist. She was a survivor, a fighter, someone who had seen the worst of humanity and still believed in the possibility of change. And in that moment, Ethan's arrogance melted away, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years: humility. The wedding night ended not with passion, but with a promise to uncover the truth, to right the wrongs, and to build something real from the ashes of their deception. But as the sun rose on their new life, one question remained. Could a marriage built on lies ever become a love built on truth? The morning after the wedding, the penthouse was eerily quiet. The grandeur of the previous night's celebration felt like a distant dream, replaced by the heavy weight of reality. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, while Clara stood by the window, staring out at the city below. The tension between them was palpable, a thick fog of unspoken words and unresolved emotions. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice rough with exhaustion. Clara turned to him, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and determination. "Now," she said softly, "we decide if this is worth saving." Ethan laughed bitterly, running a hand through his dishevelled hair. "Worth saving? You lied to me, Clara. You used me. How am I supposed to trust you after that?" Clara stepped closer, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "I didn't have a choice, Ethan. You and your friends. You're untouchable. The only way to expose the truth was from the inside." But she paused, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I didn't expect to feel anything for you, and that complicates everything." Ethan's chest tightened at her words. He wanted to be angry, to shut her out and walk away. But something about her honesty, about the vulnerability in her eyes, made it impossible. "What truth?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara took a deep breath and began to explain. She told him about the illegal deals, the exploitation, the lives ruined by the decisions made in boardrooms and backrooms. She told him about the people who had nothing, while people like him had everything. And as she spoke, Ethan felt the walls around his heart begin to crack. "I didn't know," he said, his voice trembling. "I mean, I knew things weren't perfect, but I didn't realize how bad it was." Clara nodded, her expression softening. "I believe you," she said. "But now that you do know, what are you going to do about it?" Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time he saw not a beggar or a journalist, but a woman who had risked everything to make a difference. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I want to try. I want to make things right." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Ethan opened it to find his best friend, Marcus, standing there with a smirk on his face. "Well, well," Marcus said, glancing past Ethan to Clara. "How's married life treating you?" Ethan forced a smile, but his mind was racing. Marcus was one of the people Clara had mentioned in her exposé. He was involved in some of the darkest dealings, and Ethan had no idea how to confront him. "It's complicated," Ethan said, stepping aside to let Marcus in. As the day unfolded, Ethan found himself caught between two worlds. On one side was Clara, urging him to take a stand, to use his wealth and influence for good. On the other side was Marcus, pulling him back into the life he had always known, a life of power, privilege, and moral compromise. The tension between them grew with every passing hour, until finally it reached a breaking point. That evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Ethan and Clara found themselves alone again. "You can't keep living like this," Clara said, her voice firm but gentle. "You have to choose, Ethan. You can't have both." Ethan sighed, running a hand over his face. "I know," he said, "but choosing means losing everything. My friends, my reputation, maybe even my fortune. How do I walk away from that?" Clara reached out, taking his hand in hers. "You don't have to do it alone," she said. "We can do it together. But you have to trust me." Ethan looked into her eyes, searching for the truth, and in that moment he realized that he did trust her. Maybe not completely, not yet, but enough to take the first step. "Okay," he said, squeezing her hand. "Let's do it. Let's make things right." But as they began to plan their next move, a shadow loomed over them. Marcus had grown suspicious, and he wasn't the type to let things go. He had eyes and ears everywhere, and it was only a matter of time before he discovered the truth about Clara, and about Ethan's betrayal. The stakes were higher than ever, and the danger was real. But for the first time in his life, Ethan felt like he was fighting for something that mattered, and that made all the difference. The days that followed were a whirlwind of secrecy and strategy. Ethan and Clara spent hours locked away in the penthouse, poring over documents, making phone calls, and piecing together the evidence Clara had gathered during her time undercover. Every conversation was hushed, every move calculated. They knew Marcus was watching, and one wrong step could ruin everything. But despite the tension, there was a newfound connection between them, a fragile trust that grew stronger with each passing day. One evening, as they sat surrounded by stacks of papers and half-empty coffee cups, Clara looked up at Ethan, her eyes filled with worry. "We're running out of time," she said, her voice low. "Marcus is getting suspicious. If we don't act soon, he'll figure out what we're doing." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. "I know," he said. "But we need more. We need something undeniable, something that will bring him down for good." Clara hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small USB drive. "I've been saving this," she said, handing it to him. "It's everything. Emails, recordings, financial records. It's enough to expose him, and everyone else involved." Ethan stared at the USB drive, his mind racing. This was it. The moment of truth. But as he held it in his hand, he felt a pang of doubt. "What if it's not enough?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if we do all this, and nothing changes?" Clara placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "It's enough," she said firmly. "And even if it doesn't change the world, it'll change something. It'll change you. And that's worth fighting for." The next morning, Ethan made the call. He reached out to a journalist he trusted, someone who had been trying to expose Marcus for years, but had never had the evidence to back it up. They arranged to meet in a secluded park, far from prying eyes. As Ethan handed over the USB drive, he felt a mix of relief and fear. This was the point of no return. There was no going back now. But Marcus was always one step ahead. That evening, as Ethan returned to the penthouse, he found Marcus waiting for him, his expression cold and unreadable. "We need to talk," Marcus said, his voice dangerously calm. Ethan's heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay composed. "About what?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Marcus stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "About your little project," he said. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Ethan's stomach dropped, but he refused to back down. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice steady. Marcus smirked, pulling out his phone and showing Ethan a photo of him meeting with a journalist in the park. "You're playing a dangerous game, Ethan," Marcus said, his tone icy. "And if you don't stop, you're going to regret it." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Ethan knew Marcus wasn't bluffing. He had the power to destroy lives, and he wouldn't hesitate to use it. But as Ethan looked into Marcus's eyes, he felt something shift inside him. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was angry. Angry at Marcus, at the system, at himself for letting it go on for so long. "You're right," Ethan said, his voice firm. "This is a dangerous game. But I'm not playing any more." Marcus's smirk faded, replaced by a look of genuine surprise. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You're going to lose everything." Ethan shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "Maybe," he said. "But at least I'll lose it on my own terms." As Marcus stormed out, Ethan felt a strange sense of peace. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, maybe even dangerous. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he was on the right path. And when Clara walked into the room, her eyes filled with concern, he knew he wasn't alone. "It's done," he said, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Now we wait." The days that followed were tense, each moment filled with anticipation. But when the story finally broke, it was explosive. The evidence was undeniable, and the fallout was immediate. Marcus and his associates were arrested, their empire crumbling overnight. The world watched in shock as the truth came to light, and Ethan found himself at the center of it all, not as a villain, but as a hero. But the victory came at a cost. Ethan's fortune was gone, his reputation in tatters. The life he had known was over. And yet, as he stood beside Clara, watching the sunrise over the city, he felt a sense of freedom he had never known before. Was it worth it? Clara asked, her voice soft. Ethan smiled, taking her hand in his. Every second, he said, because now I have something real. I have you. And as they walked away from the chaos, hand in hand, they knew their journey was just beginning. The road ahead would be uncertain, but for the first time, they were facing it together. And that made all the difference. The aftermath of the exposé was chaos, but for Ethan and Clara, it was also a strange kind of liberation. The world buzzed with headlines, debates, and shockwaves from the scandal that had brought down some of the city's most powerful figures. Reporters camped outside their building, desperate for a statement, but Ethan and Clara stayed hidden, choosing to focus on each other instead of the noise. For the first time in years, Ethan felt free from the weight of his wealth, his reputation, and the expectations that had defined him. But freedom came with its own challenges. They moved out of the penthouse, leaving behind the opulence that had once been Ethan's world. They found a small apartment in a quieter part of the city, a place where they could start over. It was modest, nothing like the life Ethan was used to, but it felt real. Clara watched him carefully, worried that the transition would be too much for him. But to her surprise, Ethan seemed almost relieved. "I don't miss it," he admitted one evening as they sat on the floor of their new living room, surrounded by unpacked boxes. "I thought I would, but I don't. It's like I can finally breathe." Clara smiled, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "What about your friends?" she asked gently. "Your life, everything you left behind." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Those weren't friends," he said. "They were people who wanted something from me. And my life, it wasn't really mine. It was just a role I was playing." He reached for her hand, his voice softening. "But this is real. You're real." Their bond grew stronger in those early days, but the outside world wasn't done with them. Marcus, now facing charges, wasn't going down without a fight. He had connections, resources, and a burning desire for revenge. One night, as Ethan and Clara were settling into their new routine, there was a knock at the door. Ethan opened it to find a man in a suit, his expression grim. "Mr. Blackwood," the man said, handing him an envelope. "You've been served." Ethan's heart sank as he read the contents. Marcus was suing him for defamation, claiming the evidence was fabricated. The lawsuit was a long shot, but it was enough to drag Ethan and Clara back into the spotlight, and into a legal battle they couldn't afford. "What do we do?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. Ethan clenched his jaw, his mind racing. "We fight," he said. "We fight because we have the truth on our side." The months that followed were grueling. They spent countless hours meeting with lawyers, preparing their defense, and reliving the darkest moments of their past. The stress took its toll, and there were nights when they lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if they'd made the right choice. But through it all, they held on to each other, their love becoming their anchor in the storm. The trial was a media circus, with every detail dissected and debated. Ethan took the stand, his voice steady as he recounted everything: the bet, the marriage, the lies, and the truth. He looked Marcus in the eye and didn't flinch. "You think you can destroy me," Ethan said, his voice ringing through the courtroom. "But you already did that a long time ago. The difference is, I'm not afraid of you anymore." The jury's verdict came as a shock to everyone, except Ethan and Clara. Marcus was found guilty, not just of the charges related to the exposé, but of perjury and obstruction of justice. As the gavel came down, Ethan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It was over. Finally, truly over. But as they left the courthouse, hand in hand, Clara turned to him, her eyes filled with tears. "What now?" she asked. Ethan smiled, pulling her close. "Now," he said, "we live. Not for anyone else, but for us." And they did. They built a life together, one that was far from perfect but was theirs. Ethan started a non-profit, using what was left of his wealth to help those who had been exploited by people like Marcus. Clara returned to journalism, this time as herself, telling stories that mattered. They faced challenges, of course. Money was tight, and the scars of their past never fully healed. But they faced them together, their love growing stronger with each passing day. Years later, as they stood on the balcony of their small apartment, watching the sunset, Clara leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Giving up everything?" Ethan wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Not for a second," he said, "because I didn't give up everything. I found you." And in that moment, as the city buzzed below them, they knew they had something no amount of money could buy, a love that was real, a life that was theirs, and a future filled with hope. Life had settled into a rhythm for Ethan and Clara, a quiet, steady kind of rhythm that felt like a balm after the chaos they'd endured. Their days were filled with purpose. Ethan's non-profit was gaining traction, helping countless people rebuild their lives, while Clara's journalism was making waves, shedding light on stories that had long been buried. They were happy, truly happy, in a way neither of them had thought possible. But life, as they had learned, had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected them. One evening, as they were cleaning up after dinner, Clara's phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at it, her brow furrowing as she read the message. "Ethan," she said slowly, her voice tinged with unease. "You need to see this." He walked over, drying his hands on a towel, and took the phone from her. It was a news alert. Marcus had been released from prison on a technicality. Ethan's stomach dropped. "How?" he asked, his voice tight. Clara shook her head, her face pale. "I don't know. But he's out. And he's not going to let this go." The next few days were tense. Ethan tried to focus on his work, but the shadow of Marcus's release loomed over everything. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something bad. Clara, ever the journalist, dug into the details, trying to figure out how Marcus had managed to get out. What she found was chilling. Marcus had connections, deep, dangerous connections, and he was using them to rebuild his empire. "He's not just coming after us," Clara said one night, her voice trembling. "He's coming after everything we've built." Ethan felt a surge of anger, but also fear. He had worked so hard to create something good, something meaningful. He couldn't let Marcus destroy it. "We'll fight," he said, his voice firm. "We've done it before. We can do it again." But Clara shook her head, her eyes filled with worry. "It's not that simple, Ethan. He's not the same man we took down. He's angrier, more desperate, and that makes him dangerous." Their fears were confirmed a week later when Ethan's non-profit was hit with a series of false allegations, accusations that threatened to dismantle everything he had worked for. Donors pulled out, supporters turned their backs, and the media frenzy began all over again. Ethan felt like he was back in the courtroom, fighting for his life. But this time, it wasn't just about him. It was about the people he was trying to help, people who didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire. Clara was by his side every step of the way, using her connections and her voice to push back against the lies. But it wasn't enough. Marcus was always one step ahead, his reach extending further than they had imagined. One night, as they sat in their apartment, surrounded by stacks of documents and half-empty coffee cups, Clara turned to Ethan, her eyes filled with tears. "What if we can't win this time?" she asked, her voice breaking. Ethan reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. "We have to," he said, "because if we don't, he wins. And I can't let that happen." But the pressure was mounting, and it was taking its toll. Ethan could see the exhaustion in Clara's eyes, the way her shoulders slumped under the weight of it all. He hated seeing her like this, hated that he had dragged her into this mess. "Maybe," he started, his voice hesitant, "maybe you should step back. Let me handle this." Clara's eyes flashed with anger. "No," she said firmly. "This isn't just your fight, Ethan. It's ours. And I'm not going anywhere." Her words gave him strength, but they also filled him with guilt. He didn't want to lose her, but he couldn't bear the thought of putting her in danger. And then, one night, the unthinkable happened. Clara didn't come home. Ethan waited, pacing the apartment, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When his phone finally rang, his heart stopped. It was the police. Clara had been in an accident, a hit and run. She was alive, but barely. Ethan rushed to the hospital, his mind a blur of fear and anger. He knew this wasn't an accident. Marcus had made his move, and he had struck where it would hurt the most. As Ethan sat by Clara's bedside, holding her hand, he felt a rage unlike anything he had ever known. But beneath the rage was something else, a determination, a resolve. He wasn't going to let Marcus win. Not this time. When Clara finally woke up, her voice was weak, but her words were clear. "You have to stop him," she said, her eyes filled with pain and determination. "Not for me. For us. For everyone he's hurt." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. "I will," he promised. "But I need you to fight too. I can't do this without you." And so, they prepared for the final battle. Ethan reached out to every ally he had, every person who had been wronged by Marcus, and together they formed a plan. It was risky, maybe even reckless, but it was their only shot. The night before they put their plan into action, Ethan sat by Clara's bedside, holding her hand. "No matter what happens," he said, his voice steady, "I love you, and I'll never stop fighting for us." Clara smiled, her eyes filled with tears. "I love you too," she whispered. "Now go finish this." And with that, Ethan walked out into the night, ready to face Marcus one last time. The stakes were higher than ever, but so was his resolve. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. It was about love. And it was about making sure that no one else would ever have to suffer at the hands of a man like Marcus. The fight wasn't over, but Ethan knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going down without a fight. From the glittering penthouses of New York City to the gritty streets where secrets are buried, this tale is packed with twists, heartbreak, and unforgettable moments. Will Ethan and Clara's love survive the storm? Or will the shadows of their past tear them apart? Night with stars sparkles. Backhand index pointing right. Don't miss this emotional roller coaster. Like, share, and comment below with your thoughts. Speech balloon backhand index pointing down. Red heart, love the story? Hit that like button. Link share it with your friends and family. Bell turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Hashtag love story, hashtag betrayal, hashtag redemption, hashtag must read, hashtag drama, hashtag twists, and turns hashtag emotional journey to heart's open book.